The meal was a cheerful occasion. Holmes had the ability to engage in conversation exceptionally well when he chose to. And that night he certainly chose to. He seemed to be in a heightened state of nervous excitement, displaying a brilliance I had never witnessed before. He discussed a rapid succession of topics: miracle plays, medieval pottery, Stradivarius violins, the Buddhism of Ceylon, and future warships, handling each subject as if he had devoted considerable study to it. His bright humor contrasted sharply with the dark depression he had experienced in the days prior. Athelney Jones revealed himself to be quite sociable during his moments of relaxation, approaching dinner with the demeanor of a bon vivant. As for me, I felt uplifted by the notion that we were nearing the conclusion of our task, and I found myself catching some of Holmes's gaiety. Throughout dinner, none of us mentioned the reason that had brought us together. Once the table was cleared, Holmes checked his watch and poured 3 glasses of port. He proposed a toast to the success of their little expedition, and declared it was time to set off, inquiring if I had had a pistol. I informed him that I had my old service revolver in my desk. He advised me to take it, emphasizing the importance of being prepared, then noted that the cab he had ordered was waiting outside. By the time we arrived at the Westminster Wharf, it was a little past 7, and we found our launch waiting. Holmes scrutinized it critically and asked if there was anything to identify it as a police boat. Upon confirming that the green lamp at the side served that purpose, he instructed to remove it. After a small adjustment, we boarded the vessel, and the ropes were cast off. Jones, Holmes, and I took our seats in the stern, accompanied by 1 man at the rudder, 1 tending the engines, and 2 burly police inspectors at the front. Jones inquired where we were headed, and Holmes instructed him to tell them to stop opposite Jacobson's yard at the tower. The launch proved to be quite fast, as we sped past long lines of loaded barges as if they were standing still. Holmes smiled with satisfaction as we overtook a river steamer, leaving it behind. He remarked that we ought to be capable of catching anything on the river. I countered that it was unlikely, but acknowledged that there weren't many launches that could surpass us. Holmes stated we would need to catch the Aurora, which had a reputation for speed, and then explained how he had been frustrated by what he deemed a minor setback. He had taken a break by immersing himself in a chemical analysis, reflecting on a saying by one of our greatest statesmen about how a change of work serves as the best rest. Upon successfully dissolving the hydrocarbon he had been analyzing, he returned to consider the case of the Sholtos, rethinking the entire matter. He noted that his boys had searched the river thoroughly without finding any leads. The launch had not been spotted at any landing stage or wharf, nor had it returned. Yet he deduced it could hardly have been scuttled to hide their tracks, even though that always remained a possible scenario. He believed Small possessed a degree of cunning, but lacked the sophistication for anything requiring delicate finesse, typically a trait of higher education. He further theorized that since Small had been in London for some time, as evidenced by his ongoing surveillance of Pondicherry Lodge, he would need a bit of time to arrange his affairs before leaving. That was the prevailing balance of probability. I expressed my skepticism, suggesting it seemed a bit weak, positing it was more likely he had organized his affairs before embarking on his expedition. Holmes disagreed, reasoning that Small would value his hideout too much to abandon it without certainty that he could manage without it. He then introduced another consideration. Jonathan Small must have realized that the unusual appearance of his companion, regardless of how well he was disguised, could lead to gossip and possibly be linked to the Norwood tragedy. He was astute enough to recognize that they had left their headquarters under the cover of darkness and would want to return before daylight. According to Mrs. Smith, they had obtained the boat shortly after 3 o'clock, meaning it would be broad daylight soon, and people would be about. Thus, he concluded, they did not venture far. They had likely compensated Smith handsomely to keep quiet, reserved the launch for their final escape, and hurried back to their lodgings with the treasure box. After a couple of nights, once they had a chance to gauge public reaction and any suspicion from the papers, They would slip away under the cover of night to a ship at Gravesend or in the Downs, where they presumably had already arranged for passage to America or the colony. But the launch? I interjected. They couldn't have taken that to their lodgings. Exactly. I reasoned that the launch must be nearby despite its current invisibility. I considered what I would do if I were in Small's position. He would likely think that returning the launch or leaving it at a wharf would make it too easy for the police to pursue him if they got on his trail. How could he hide the launch, yet have it accessible when needed? The only solution that came to mind was to hand it over to a boat builder or repairer, instructing them to make a minor change to it. It would then be moved to their yard or shed, effectively concealing it, while still being accessible with a few hours' notice. That seems simple enough, I replied. It's precisely these simple methods that are often overlooked. Nevertheless, I decided to act on the idea. I set off in this inconspicuous seaman's attire and inquired at various yards down the river. I came up empty at 15 locations, but at the 16th Jacobson's I discovered that the Aurora had been handed over to them 2 days earlier by a wooden-legged man, who had provided trivial instructions regarding her rudder. The foreman mentioned that there was nothing wrong with the rudder and pointed out the launch with red streaks. At that moment, Mordecai Smith, the missing owner, appeared, noticeably the worse for wear from drink. I initially would not have recognized him, but he announced his name and that of his launcho. He insisted he needed it at 8 o'clock that night sharp because he had 2 gentlemen who wouldn't wait. He had evidently been well compensated, as he was freely tossing shillings to the men. I followed him for a while, but he disappeared into a tavern, prompting me to return to the yard. On my way back, I picked up one of my boys and positioned him as a lookout over the launch. He was instructed to stand at the water's edge and wave his handkerchief to us when they set off. We would be lying off in the stream, and it would be remarkable if we didn't capture them, along with the treasure. You have organized it all quite neatly, whether they are the right men or not, Jones remarked. However, if it were my operation, I would have stationed a team of police in Jacobson's yard to arrest them when they came down. That would have been futile. Small is quite a clever fellow. He would send a scout ahead, and if anything raised his suspicions, he would hide away for another week. But you might have stuck with Mordecai Smith and tracked them to their hideout, I suggested. In that case, I would have wasted my day. I believe there's 100 to 1 chance that Smith knows where they are hiding. As long as he has liquor and good pay, why would he bother asking questions? They send him instructions on what to do. No, I considered every possible course of action, and this is the best. As this conversation unfolded, we navigated a series of bridges spanning the Thames. As we passed the city, the last rays of sunlight glinted off the cross atop St. Paul's. Twilight enveloped us by the time we reached the tower. Holmes pointed out Jacobson's yard, highlighting the tangle of masts and rigging on the Surrey side, advising us to cruise gently up and down beneath the cover of the line of lighters. He retrieved a pair of night glasses from his pocket and scanned the shore for some time. He noted he could see my sentry at his post, but no sign of a handkerchief. Jones eagerly proposed that we head downstream a short way and wait for them. By this point, we were all filled with anticipation, even the policemen and stokers, who had only a vague understanding of the situation. Holmes responded that we had no right to assume anything. While it was indeed likely they would head downstream, we could not be certain. From our position, we had a clear view of the entrance to the yard, and they would have difficulty seeing us. It was a clear night, and there was plenty of light. We needed to remain where we were, observing the throng of people moving about in the gaslight. "They are coming from work in the yard," Jones observed. Holmes remarked on their dirty appearance, but mused that everyone must possess some hidden spark of immortality. He suggested that one might not guess that from their looks, pointing out the lack of any a priori probability. He considered man to be a strange enigma. I suggested that someone had once called him a soul, concealed in an animal. Holmes referenced Winwood Reade's insights on the matter, noting that while the individual is an insoluble puzzle, collectively, they become a mathematical certainty. One cannot predict the actions of a single individual, but one can accurately gauge the behavior of a larger group. He continued to scan the shore, and suddenly exclaimed that he spotted a white flutter in the distant sea. I confirmed that I could see my boy clearly, and Holmes then pointed out the Aurora, which was moving at a rapid pace. He ordered the engineer to put the boat full speed ahead, expressing his determination to catch her, vowing that he would never forgive himself if she managed to outpace us. The Aurora had slipped unnoticed through the yard entrance and had already gathered speed, darting down the river close to the shore. Jones regarded her solemnly and shook his head, expressing doubt about our chances of catching her. Holmes insisted we must catch her, urging the stokers to make the vessel perform at its maximum capacity, declaring that if they had to burn the boat, they would still pursue their quarry. We were now in hot pursuit. The furnaces roared, and the powerful engines whirred and clanked, resembling a massive metallic heart. The sharp prow sliced through the river, sending waves rolling to either side. With each throb of the engines, the boat leapt and quivered as if it were alive. A single yellow lantern at our bow cast a long, flickering beam ahead. Ahead of us, a dark shadow on the water identified the Aurora, with the wake of white foam behind her indicating her speed. We sped past barges, steamers, and merchant vessels, weaving in and out, despite the voices calling out to us from the darkness. The Aurora continued to thunder along, and we followed closely. "Pour it on, men, pour it on!" Holmes shouted down to the engine room, the fierce glow from below illuminating his eager aquiline features. "Get every ounce of steam you can." Jones observed that we seemed to be gaining slightly. I concurred, confident that we would catch up to her in just a few moments. However, at that moment, a tug towing 3 barges unexpectedly drifted into our path. We narrowly avoided a collision by sharply turning our helm, but in the time it took to navigate around the obstruction, the Aurora had gained a significant 200 yards. She remained within sight, and the murky twilight transitioned into a clear, starlit night. Our boilers were pushed to their limits, and the fragile hull vibrated and creaked under the strain of the powerful energy propelling us forward. We had sped through the pool, past the West India docks, down the long Deptford Reach, and back up again after rounding the Isle of Dogs. The indistinct blur ahead now clearly resolved into the sleek form of the Aurora. Jones directed our searchlight towards her, allowing us to see the figures on deck. One man sat at the stern, hunched over something dark between his knees, while a mass that resembled a Newfoundland dog lay beside him. The boy was at the tiller, and against the red glow of the furnace we could see old Smith, stripped to the waist, shoveling coal with urgent fervor. They may have initially questioned whether we were truly pursuing them, but as we followed closely behind their every move, any doubt vanished. At Greenwich, we were about 300 paces behind, and by Blackwall we had closed the gap to no more than 250. I had chased many creatures across various countries during my varied life, but nothing had ever offered such a wild thrill as this frantic manhunt down the Thames. Steadily we drew closer, yard by yard. In the stillness of the night we could hear the panting and clanking of their machinery. The man at the stern remained crouched, seemingly busy but often glancing back at us to gauge the distance between us. We advanced nearer and nearer until Jones yelled for them to stop. We were now merely 4 boat lengths behind them, both vessels racing at breakneck speed. The river ahead was clear, bordered by Barking Level on one side and the desolate Plumstead Marshes on the other. At our shout, the man at the stern sprang up, shaking his fists at us and cursing in a high, cracked voice. He was a large, powerful man, and as he stood with his legs apart, we could see that he had only a wooden stump from the thigh down on his right side. At the sound of his furious, strident shouts, The huddled figure on the deck stirred. It rose into view, revealing a diminutive black man, the smallest I had ever seen, bearing a large, misshapen head and a mass of tangled hair. Holmes had already drawn his revolver, and I followed suit at the sight of this grotesque, savage creature. He was wrapped in some dark ulster or blanket, leaving only his face exposed, but that face was enough to haunt a person's dreams. I had never encountered features so deeply etched with bestiality and cruelty. His small eyes shone with a dark fire, and his thick lips curled back from his teeth, which were bared in a half-animalistic fury. Holmes quietly instructed that we should fire if he raised his hand. At that point, we were within a boat's length of our target, almost within reach of our quarry. I could clearly envision the two of them, the white man, legs apart, yelling curses, and the grotesque dwarf with his hideous visage and strong yellow teeth gnashing at us in the glow of our lantern. It was fortunate we had such a clear view of him. Just as we gazed upon him, he pulled a short, round piece of wood from beneath his covering and pressed it to his lips. Our pistols discharged simultaneously. He spun around, threw up his arms, and with a choking cough fell sideways into the water. I caught a fleeting glimpse of his venomous, threatening eyes amidst the white swirl of the river. At that moment, the wooden-legged man seized the rudder and yanked it hard, steering the boat toward the southern bank, while we narrowly passed by her stern. We quickly turned to pursue her again, but she was already making for the bank. It was a wild, desolate area where the moonlight shimmered across a vast stretch of marshland, dotted with stagnant pools and decaying vegetation. With a dull thud, the launch ran aground on the mud bank, her bow raised, and her stern flush with the water. The fugitive leapt out, but his stump immediately sank deep into the sodden earth. He struggled and writhed in vain, unable to move either forward or backward. In a fit of impotent rage, he kicked furiously into the mud with his other foot, but his struggles only drove his wooden pin deeper into the mire. When we brought our launch alongside, he was so firmly anchored that we had to throw a rope over his shoulders to haul him out, dragging him aboard like some wretched fish. The Smiths, both father and son, sat sullenly in their launch, but complied meekly when ordered to come aboard. We secured the Aurora to our stern, revealing a solid iron chest of intricate Indian craftsmanship on the deck. There was no key, but its considerable weight indicated it was undoubtedly the same chest that had contained the ill-fated treasure of the Sholtos. As we made our way back upstream, we scanned the surroundings with our searchlight, but found no sign of the islander. Somewhere in the dark depths of the Thames lay the remains of that peculiar visitor to our shores. Holmes pointed to the wooden hatchway, noting that we hadn't been quick enough with our pistols. Indeed, just behind where we had been standing was one of those lethal darts we recognized all too well. It must have whizzed by us at the moment we fired. Holmes smiled at it and shrugged his shoulders nonchalantly, but I felt a wave of nausea at the thought of how narrowly we had escaped a horrific fate that night.